A Marine private crouches in a shell hole on Loaf Hill, surrounded by the bodies of his friends. He's been fighting for 3 days straight without sleep. His uniform is soaked with a mixture of rain, mud, and blood, some of it his own. Every few seconds, Japanese artillery shells scream in and explode, throwing more mud and body parts into the air. Machine gun fire tears through anyone who tries to move. He can see the top of the hill just 60 yards away, but those 60 yards might as well be 60 miles. 11 Marines from his platoon tried to take that crest this morning. One came back. Now it's his turn to go. He knows what's waiting up there, and he knows he's probably going to die. But he goes anyway because that's what Marines do. This is Loaf Hill in May 1945, and for 10 days it was the most hellish piece of real estate on Earth. This is the story of how the 6th Marine Regiment fought one of the most brutal battles in Marine Corps history, and why a small hill in Okinawa cost more American lives than most people can comprehend. Let's set the stage because you need to understand what Okinawa was and why Loaf Hill mattered so much. Okinawa is a Japanese island about 350 miles south of mainland Japan. By April 1945, American forces were closing in on Japan itself. They'd island-hopped across the Pacific, taking Iwo Jima just weeks before. Okinawa was supposed to be the final stepping stone before the invasion of Japan. It was intended to serve as a massive staging base for the invasion. American planners expected fierce resistance, but they believed the island could be taken in a matter of weeks. They were catastrophically wrong. The Japanese had 100,000 troops on Okinawa, and they prepared the most sophisticated defense in depth that American forces had encountered in the Pacific War. Instead of fighting on the beaches as they had on other islands, the Japanese had pulled back into the southern part of Okinawa, where the terrain was ideal for defense. Ridges, hills, caves, and ravines created natural fortifications. The Japanese had months to prepare, digging tunnels, building bunkers, and positioning artillery. They planned to bleed the Americans white, to kill so many Americans that the cost of invading Japan would seem unbearable. Okinawa wasn't just about defending an island. It was about showing America what invading Japan would cost. The 6th Marine Regiment was part of the 6th Marine Division, which landed on Okinawa on April 1, 1945. The initial landing was easy, almost suspiciously easy, no opposition on the beaches. The Marines moved inland quickly. However, as they pushed south toward the Japanese defenses, everything changed. The real fighting began in early May when Marine divisions reached the main Japanese defensive line. This line was anchored on several key terrain features. The most important of these was a cluster of 3 hills. The Japanese referred to them as the Shuri Heights. Americans would know them as Loaf Hill, Half Moon Hill, and Horseshoe Hill. These 3 hills formed a mutually supporting defensive system. Sugarloaf was in the center. Half Moon was to its right. Horseshoe was behind it. Each hill could engulf the others in flames. You couldn't take one without taking all 3. But you couldn't take all 3 simultaneously because there weren't enough troops. So American commanders had to choose. They chose Sugarloaf as the priority target. It had to be taken before the others could be assaulted. This meant Sugarloaf would become the focal point of Japanese defensive fire from all 3 hills. It was going to be hell, but nobody fully grasped just how bad it would be. Loaf Hill doesn't look impressive in photographs. It's maybe 50 feet high, a small rise covered in scrub vegetation. Before the battle, locals referred to it as a hill, but Americans would have called it a bump. You could walk up it in a couple of minutes under normal conditions. But these weren't normal conditions. The Japanese had turned Sugarloaf into a killing ground. They dug caves and tunnels throughout the hill. These weren't crude holes in the ground. These were reinforced positions with overhead cover that could withstand naval bombardment and airstrikes. The Japanese had positioned machine guns to create interlocking fields of fire across the entire hill. They had mortars pre-registered on every approach. Artillery from Half Moon and Horseshoe could hit any point on Sugarloaf. The Japanese defenders were mostly from the 44th Independent Mixed Brigade, experienced troops who'd been fighting since the China campaigns. They weren't suicidal fanatics, though Western propaganda often portrayed them that way. They were professional soldiers executing a well-planned defense with skill and determination. Their mission was to hold Sugarloaf as long as possible and kill as many Marines as possible in the process. They understood they would probably die doing this. Japanese defensive doctrine at this point in the war accepted that positions would eventually fall. The goal was to make each position so costly to the Americans that the eventual victory would seem Pyrrhic. The battle for Sugarloaf began on May 12, 1945. The 6th Marines were ordered to take the hill. The regimental commander, Colonel Horatio Woodhouse, assigned the mission to the 2nd Battalion, 6th Marines. Company G led the assault. The Marines moved out in the morning through a wasteland of shell craters and destroyed vegetation. Japanese artillery opened up immediately. The Marines pushed through it because they are known for persevering through any challenge. They reached the base of Sugarloaf and started up the slope. That's when the machine guns opened fire. Japanese machine gunners had waited until the Marines were fully committed to the assault, as they climbed the slope where they couldn't easily take cover. Then they opened up from multiple positions simultaneously. Marines started falling. The survivors pushed forward because retreating down the slope would have meant staying exposed to fire for longer. Some Marines made it to the crest. They discovered the top of Sugarloaf was bare ground swept by fire from Half Moon and Horseshoe. Any Marine who reached the top became a target for every Japanese weapon within range. The Marines on top tried to dig in, but the ground was so hard and the fire so intense that digging was nearly impossible. Company G held the crest for about an hour before being driven off by counterattacks from Japanese troops emerging from tunnels and caves. The Marines who survived retreated down the hill, leaving their dead and wounded behind. The first assault had failed, resulting in heavy casualties. But orders were orders. Company G reorganized and attacked again in the afternoon. Same result. They suffered casualties while advancing up the hill, briefly held the crest, but were driven off by counterattacks and overwhelming fire from the other hills. By nightfall, Company G was combat ineffective, having lost over half its men in one day. Company F took over and attacked on May 13th, same pattern. Take casualties advancing. Briefly hold the crest. Get driven off. Company F was shredded just like Company G. Company E went in next. Shredded. The 2nd Battalion, which started with about 800 men, was down to about 400 after 3 days. The hill had to be taken, so the 3rd Battalion, 6th Marines was committed. They fared no better. Attack, take casualties, briefly hold the top, get counterattacked, retreat. Over and over again. Day after day, night after night. The pattern never changed because the tactical situation never changed. The only thing that changed was the casualty count, which continued to climb. Let me describe what combat on Sugarloaf actually looked like, because the statistics don't capture the horror. You're a Marine in one of these assaults. You move forward with your squad through a landscape that looks like the moon. There's no vegetation left, just shell craters and mud. As you get closer to the hill, Japanese artillery starts landing around you. Not random fire. Precise, pre-registered fire because the Japanese have had weeks to calculate exactly where to drop shells. Men around you are hit by shrapnel. Some die instantly. Others scream and writhe in agony. The corpsmen try to help, but they're targets too. Many corpsmen died on Sugarloaf. You reach the base of the hill and start climbing. It's muddy and slippery from rain and blood. You have to crawl over the bodies of Marines who died in previous assaults. Some of these bodies have been there for days, decomposing in the heat and rain. The smell is indescribable. As you climb higher, machine gun fire starts. You can hear the bullets snapping past your head, that distinctive crack that means they're close. Men around you are hit. You keep moving because stopping means dying. You fire your rifle at suspected Japanese positions, but you rarely see the enemy. They're in caves and bunkers that are nearly invisible until you're right on top of them. If you're lucky enough to reach the crest, you find yourself on completely open ground under fire from 3 directions. Half Moon Hill is to your right. Horseshoe behind you. Surviving Japanese on Sugarloaf itself, emerging from tunnels you didn't know existed. Artillery shells are exploding constantly. The ground shakes continuously. Your ears are ringing so badly that you can't hear orders being shouted from 5 feet away. You try to dig in, but the ground is like concrete, and every time you raise your entrenching tool, you draw fire. Other Marines around you are being hit. You might last an hour before Japanese infantry counterattacks from the tunnels, and you have to fall back or die. The retreat down the hill is as bad as the advance up it. You're exposed to fire the entire way. Many Marines were hit in the back as they withdrew. Wounded men who couldn't move on their own often had to be left behind, because trying to carry them under fire meant both the injured man and the rescuer would die. These decisions, leaving friends behind knowing they'll die, broke some men psychologically. The survivors stagger back to the jump-off point, exhausted and traumatized, knowing they'll have to do it all again in a few hours because the hill still needs to be taken. Night fighting on Sugarloaf was even worse. The Japanese would infiltrate Marine positions using their tunnel network. They'd appear behind Marine lines and attack from unexpected directions. Marines had to stay awake and alert all night, knowing Japanese soldiers might emerge from the ground at any moment. The darkness turned every sound into a potential threat. The Japanese would throw grenades into Marine foxholes. Marines would respond by throwing grenades at any movement. Sometimes they killed each other in the darkness by mistake. Exhaustion made everything harder. Marines were going days without sleep, operating on adrenaline and fear. The Japanese also used psychological warfare. They'd call out in English, taunting the Marines, or imitating American voices to create confusion. They'd scream before banzai charges to unsettle defenders. They'd play on Marine radios sometimes, having intercepted frequencies. Some of this was effective, but mostly it just made Marines angrier. The Japanese might have broken some armies with these tactics, but the Marines responded by fighting harder. The psychological warfare backfired in that sense, but it added to the general atmosphere of horror that characterized Sugarloaf. By May 16th, after 5 days of constant fighting, the 6th Marines had suffered over 1,500 casualties and still didn't control Sugarloaf. The regiment was being bled white for a hill that most people couldn't even see from a distance. Higher command was demanding results. The division commander wanted the hill taken immediately. But how? Every frontal assault ended the same way. The Marines would adjust tactics, try different approaches, coordinate artillery and air support better, but the result was always the same. Take casualties. Briefly hold the crest. Get driven off. The Japanese defensive system was just too strong to overcome with the forces and tactics available. The breakthrough came when American commanders finally understood they had to take all 3 hills simultaneously. As long as the Japanese held Half Moon and Horseshoe, they could make holding Sugarloaf impossible with their supporting fire. On May 18th, a coordinated assault was launched against all 3 hills. This meant spreading forces thinner, but it prevented the Japanese from concentrating all their defensive fire on Sugarloaf. It also meant the Marines had to fight on 3 hills at once, which increased overall casualties, but made success on each hill more achievable. The 6th Marines attacked Sugarloaf again, while other units attacked Half Moon and Horseshoe. This time, when the Marines reached the crest of Sugarloaf, the supporting fire from the other hills was reduced because those hills were also under attack. Japanese defenders could no longer concentrate all their forces on Sugarloaf. The Marines held the crest longer this time. They established a perimeter. They started clearing the tunnels and caves with flamethrowers, satchel charges, and grenades. This was brutal close-quarters fighting. Flamethrower operators had life expectancies measured in minutes because Japanese defenders targeted them immediately. But slowly, methodically, the Marines cleared the Japanese positions. The Japanese launched multiple counterattacks to retake the hill, but for the first time, the Marines had enough force on the crest to hold against them. More Marines poured up the hill to reinforce. Engineers brought up explosives to seal caves and tunnels. By May 19th, after 8 days of constant combat, Loaf Hill was finally in American hands. The cost had been staggering. The 6th Marines alone suffered over 2,600 casualties in the battle for Sugarloaf. That's nearly 3 times the regiment's normal strength. When you factor in attached units and supporting forces, total American casualties for Sugarloaf exceeded 4,000 men killed and wounded. For one small hill. In 8 days, Japanese casualties were equally horrific, though exact numbers are harder to determine. Most of the Japanese defenders died, some from combat. Some were sealed in caves and tunnels that were blown shut. Others died from lack of food and water as the siege dragged on. The Japanese fought with incredible tenacity. Many wounded Japanese soldiers refused medical treatment and continued fighting until they were killed. Some held out in sealed tunnels for days after the hill fell, eventually dying of suffocation or starvation. The bodies were everywhere. Marines counted over 2,000 dead Japanese on and around Sugarloaf, but the real number was certainly higher. The psychological toll on the Marines who fought at Sugarloaf was immense. These were men who'd been through brutal combat before. Many were veterans of other Pacific campaigns. But Sugarloaf broke some of them mentally. The constant exposure to death, the inability to help wounded friends, the knowledge that every assault would probably fail, and the possibility that you might die achieving nothing was psychologically devastating. Some men stopped functioning, staring blankly at nothing. Others became reckless, taking unnecessary risks because they'd accepted they were going to die anyway. Some survived physically but came home with what we'd now recognize as severe PTSD. In 1945, they called it combat fatigue or shell shock, and the treatment was basically to send them back into combat after a brief rest. The heroism displayed at Sugarloaf was remarkable. Corpsmen who repeatedly exposed themselves to fire to treat wounded Marines. Officers who led from the front and died in the process. Enlisted Marines who held positions alone when everyone else was killed or wounded. Men who carried wounded friends down the hill under fire. The Medal of Honor recommendations that came out of Sugarloaf numbered in the dozens, though only a few were actually awarded. Every Marine who fought there deserved recognition for what they endured and accomplished, but individual heroism became meaningless when everyone was heroic. How do you single out particular acts of courage when the act of being there at all required extraordinary courage? The battle for Sugarloaf had strategic implications beyond the immediate tactical situation. It demonstrated to American planners just how costly an invasion of mainland Japan would be. If one small hill on Okinawa cost 4,000 casualties in 8 days, what would storming Japan's beaches cost? Millions of casualties seemed plausible. This reality influenced the decision to use atomic bombs rather than invade. The suffering at Sugarloaf helped end the war, but that's small comfort to the men who died there or the survivors who lived with the trauma forever. After Sugarloaf fell, the battle for Okinawa continued for another month. The Marines had to take more hills, more fortified positions. The fighting remained brutal, though no single battle matched Sugarloaf's intensity. By the time Okinawa was declared secure in late June 1945, American casualties totaled over 50,000, including nearly 12,000 killed. Japanese casualties were over 100,000. Okinawan civilian casualties numbered in the tens of thousands, many of them killed by the Japanese military or forced to commit suicide. The entire campaign was a nightmare, but Sugarloaf stood out even in that nightmarish context as uniquely horrible. The 6th Marine Regiment was pulled off the line after Sugarloaf to rest and refit. They'd lost so many men that the regiment had to be substantially rebuilt with replacements. These new Marines joined a unit that had been through hell, and it showed. The veterans had a 1,000-yard stare that unnerved the replacements. They didn't talk much about what they'd been through. What was there to say? The survivors of Sugar Loaf carried those memories for the rest of their lives. Reunions decades later would sometimes end with men breaking down as they remembered friends who died on that hill. Some never talked about it at all. The trauma was too deep. When you visit Sugar Loaf Hill today, it's peaceful. The vegetation has grown back. There's a memorial marking the site of the battle. Japanese and American tourists walk the ground where Marines and Japanese soldiers killed each other in some of the most brutal close-quarters combat of the war. The hill itself looks insignificant. You can walk up it in 2 minutes easily. But if you close your eyes and try to imagine what it was like in May 1945, you can't. The human mind can't really process that level of violence and horror unless you've experienced it directly. The lessons from Sugar Loaf are both military and human in nature. Militarily, it showed the dangers of underestimating enemy defensive capabilities and the importance of understanding how terrain features support each other. It demonstrated that superior firepower and air support can't overcome well-prepared defensive positions without close assault by infantry. And it proved that some battles can only be won by men willing to walk into almost certain death to accomplish the mission. Humanly, it showed the extraordinary courage ordinary men can display when required and the terrible cost that courage exacts. Every man who fought at Sugar Loaf was changed by it. Most were damaged by it. Some never recovered. The 6th Marines' fight for Sugar Loaf deserves to be remembered as one of the finest and most terrible moments in Marine Corps history. These men accomplished the mission despite odds that should have been insurmountable. They took a position that was nearly impossible to carry and held it despite everything the enemy threw at them. They did this knowing the cost would be horrific and accepting that cost anyway. That's not just courage. That's something beyond courage. A kind of dedication and sacrifice that's hard to comprehend if you haven't been in similar situations. The Marines who died on Sugar Loaf gave everything. The Marines who survived gave nearly everything and spent the rest of their lives processing what they'd been through. If this account of one of the most brutal battles in Marine Corps history moved you, if it gave you a new appreciation for what Marines accomplished in the Pacific War, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. We're telling the stories that need to be said about World War II, the battles that tested men beyond what should be humanly endurable, the sacrifices that saved the world. Thanks for watching, and remember, freedom isn't free. It's paid for in places like Sugar Loaf Hill by men who answered when called.